The rifle case felt heavier than it should have. Chief Petty Officer Ronnie Caldwell stood at the main gate of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado just before dawn, the Pacific wind carrying salt and something colder than the temperature warranted.
The new model?
She had
Yes, sir.
carried that
Enhanced
case
scope.
for 11
How's the
years.
adjustment?
Not
Smooth, sir.
literally.
Good.
Not the
Perfect.
entire 11 years. But the weight of it, the meaning wrapped inside its matte black foam and scratched aluminum latches, had pressed against her since the afternoon they lowered retired Chief Warrant Officer Isaiah Morales into the California clay, and she had walked away from the grave still holding his last gift to her. The tag on the case read, CPO R. Caldwell, NSW Joint Long-Range Precision Assessment Program, Detachment 1. She had read those words perhaps 40 times since receiving her orders 17 days ago. Each time, they felt slightly less real. Each time, she let herself believe them a little more. Before we go any further into this story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who carried something heavier than anyone around them ever understood. Someone who showed up anyway, every single day, without asking for recognition or applause. The security guard at the gate, Haze, a lance corporal who looked like he had been awake since before the California dawn even considered arriving, checked her credentials twice. His eyes moved from her identification card to her face to the case and back to her face. That particular sequence of glances, that specific hesitation, she had catalogued it over the years the way a field naturalist catalogues species. It meant the same thing every time. She thanked him before he could form whatever opinion had begun assembling behind his eyes, shouldered the case's carry strap, and walked through the gate. The base was not quiet at 0517 hours in February. Coronado never slept completely. To her left, a line of BUDOS candidates jogged along the beach road in the darkness, their silhouettes precise and exhausted, their breath punching white clouds into the cold air. To her right, a maintenance crew worked under halogen lights, servicing what appeared to be a pair of Zodiac combat rubber raiding craft near Building 624. The whole compound smelled of JP-8 fuel, salt water, and institutional ambition. Ronnie knew this base. She had passed through it 6 times in 9 years, always in transit, always attached to something larger than herself. She had never been here as the person the orders were written for. This time was different. And this time, she told herself, walking toward the joint NSW assessment facility at the eastern edge of the compound, she was going to be very difficult to ignore. The assessment program that had pulled her here was not widely advertised. It had no formal name in any publicly accessible Navy document. In the internal chain of command routing, it existed as JLPAP DET-1, a 6-week joint evaluation curriculum designed to push the absolute ceiling of documented naval precision fire capability. The concept had originated 3 years prior, after a combined forces command review revealed a growing gap between what American military snipers could accomplish on paper and what adversarial precision units were quietly demonstrating in field operations in contested regions. Someone at Naval Special Warfare Command had read the assessment with enough alarm to request a dedicated evaluation program. A retired 3-star general with a hunting background and a reputation for institutional directness had signed the authorization. And that authorization had, through a process Ronnie could not fully trace, eventually produced a set of orders with her name on them. She was one of 7 operators selected for this program. The other 6 were men. All of them were Navy SEALs. All of them had at least one deployment to either Iraq, Afghanistan, or the Pacific Theater. 3 of them held confirmed long-range records within their own unit histories. One of them, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Velacourt, had reportedly put a round on a moving vehicle at 1,847 meters in Helmand Province in 2019 using a modified M40A6. That record existed in the kind of paperwork that required a security clearance to access. Ronnie Caldwell was not a SEAL. She was Navy Special Operations qualified through a different track, a combat operations intelligence pathway that had been quietly opened to women with exceptional marksmanship records following a 2019 policy revision. She had graduated first in her class from the NSW Basic Sniper course 3 years ago. Her cumulative score across all known distance qualifications was 97.3 out of a possible 100, the highest recorded female score in Naval Special Warfare history and the 3rd highest overall score of any candidate in the preceding 8 years. None of that was written on her face. None of it was sewn onto her uniform. She wore her rank, her qualification insignias, her campaign ribbons, and nothing else. She had learned a long time ago that quiet was a form of armor. Inside the Jalapap assessment facility, a prefabricated office structure attached to a long, low concrete block building that smelled permanently of bore solvent and gun oil, the other 6 candidates were already assembled. They stood in 2 rough clusters near a briefing table, coffee cups in hand, the particular informal posture of men who had been somewhere worse than this and had lived to find it funny. Master Chief Petty Officer Donovan Sherrick was not among them. He was standing at the far end of the briefing table, reviewing a printed document, and he was the first one to look up when Ronia pushed open the door. Sherrick was 51 years old. He had spent 23 years in naval special warfare, most of it with SEAL Team 3 and a final 4 years in an advisory capacity attached to DevGru training operations. He was not a large man in the way that the word large implied raw dimension, but he was the kind of physically compressed that suggested the weight of him was different from what the surface showed. His face carried the particular permanent squint of someone who had spent years looking at distances most people never tried to measure. He wore his rank the way generals wore medals, not as decoration but as blunt statement of territory. He looked at Ronia for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked at the case she was carrying. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. Something in the space between amusement and contempt that occupied no polite category in human communication. The other 6 men in the room said nothing. 2 of them looked at the table. One of them, the youngest one, a petty officer second class with sandy hair and a constellation of sun damage across his nose that suggested years of desert deployments, looked at Ronia with an expression that was neither dismissive nor welcoming but simply open, the way a person looks when they are deciding what they think. "Caldwell," Sherrick said, setting down his document. His voice was the kind of control that required practice to achieve. "Chief Petty Officer." "Master Chief." She set the case down with controlled care, the latches facing up. "Good morning. You're the 7th. He said it the way someone identifies a piece of equipment that arrived in the wrong shipment. Not hostile, not welcoming, categorically incorrect. "I am." She pulled out a chair and sat down. Sherrick looked at the case again. His gaze had a calibrated quality, the kind developed by someone who had spent years evaluating equipment and had long since applied that same process to people. "What are you running?" She told him. The silence that followed was brief but specific. She had experienced it before. It was the silence of someone recalculating, not because they were impressed, but because they needed to update their dismissal with the correct technical reasoning. "TAC 50A1, Sherrick repeated. "Modified. Modified. By you. By me." He nodded once, the way a physician nods when a patient reports a symptom that confirms an existing diagnosis. "All right." He picked up his document again. "Take your seat." She was already sitting. She did not point this out. If you've ever walked into a room where people had already decided what you were before you opened your mouth, drop a comment and tell us about it. Tell us about the room you walked into anyway, and what happened after. The first full day of the Jalapap assessment curriculum began at 0600 with a documentation review and proceeded through 9 hours of technical qualification verification, ballistic data review, and equipment inspection. Sherrick ran the day with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times, moving through each station with a clipboard and a series of questions that were technically accurate and organizationally correct and carried, beneath their procedural surface, a subtle architecture of disadvantage. When he reached Ronia's position at Station 4, where each candidate was required to present and verbally justify their primary weapon system configuration, he spent 14 minutes at her table. He spent an average of 6 minutes at each of the other 6 stations. He asked her to explain the modification to the trigger assembly. He asked her to justify the non-standard suppressor configuration. He asked her to produce documentation for the Schmidt and Bender 5-25x56 PMII optic she had mounted, noting that the program's standard optic list included the US Optics ST10 and 3 other approved systems, and that her optic was not among them. She produced the documentation. She had brought copies. She had anticipated every question he asked and 3 more he did not ask, and she answered each one with the precision of someone who had rehearsed not because she was nervous but because she understood the terrain she was crossing. He reviewed her documentation for 4 minutes. He made 2 notes on his clipboard. He moved on. The young petty officer with the sun-damaged nose, whose name she had learned by the end of the morning was Derek Turin, 26 years old, 18 months out of BUDOS Class 314, was positioned at Station 5. He watched the entirety of Sherrick's 14-minute evaluation of Ronia's equipment from across the table without expression. After Sherrick moved on, Derek caught Ronia's eye for a fraction of a second. He looked at his own documentation folder, then back at her, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod that said, in the vocabulary of experienced operators who communicated in economy, "I saw that." She acknowledged it the same way. Then she returned to her own work. By 1800 hours on the first day, the 7 candidates had been divided into 2 informal groups for the evening meal. The grouping was not assigned. It was self-selected, which made it more significant than any official division could have been. 5 of the men ate together at one end of the mess section, the comfortable cluster of history and shared vocabulary. Petty Officer Turin carried his tray to the table where Ronia was already seated, sat down across from her, and ate without the performance of it. "You know he's going to make this difficult," Turin said, after a few minutes. "I know." She didn't look up from her food. "Not impossible, just difficult. Nothing that matters is easy," she said. It was something Isaiah Morales had told her during her 3rd week of her basic sniper qualification, when she had been lying prone in a California scrubland for 6 consecutive hours and her spotter had told her the wind had shifted again and she would need to recalculate her firing solution for the 4th time. She had been 24 years old and the calculation had made her want to close her eyes. Morales had said those words from somewhere behind her, his voice like gravel and tobacco, and she had recalculated. Turin looked at her for a moment. "He told Velicourt that you were assigned here by quota pressure from someone above his pay grade." She ate in silence for 3 seconds. "What did Velicourt say?" "Nothing. His Sherrick's guy. Has been since Sherrick was his OIC in SEAL Team 3. Turin picked at his food. "Rask too. Gunnery Sergeant Rask. His technically joint program, Army Liaison, but he follows Sherrick around like he's waiting for an assignment." "That's 4 of them," she said. "Yeah." He paused. "The other 2 are Hernandez and Park. They are keeping their heads down. They just want their evaluations." She considered this. The social map of a closed training environment was not dissimilar to the topography maps she studied before a long-range exercise, ridges and valleys, concealed approaches and exposed ground. She had been reading this particular map since 05:17 that morning. "What about you?" she said. "What do you want from this program?" Derek Turin was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was deliberate, like a pause button pressed by someone who was genuinely thinking rather than constructing. "I want to know if I can actually do what I think I can do," he said. "I want the truth of it. Not the paperwork truth. The actual number." He looked at her rifle case, visible through the open door of the adjacent equipment room. "What about you?" She opened her hand, palm up, the way her mentor used to when he was about to say something that required space around it. "Same," she said. The first week passed in controlled increments. The curriculum moved through known distance qualification shooting in precise stages: 300 meters, 500, 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500. Each stage required the candidate to demonstrate consistent sub-MOA accuracy across a minimum of 5 rounds, with wind calls made by the candidate's own spotter and data recorded by Sherrick's team. The wind on the Coronado Range came off the Pacific in variable gusts that averaged 11 knots but spiked irregularly, making clean data difficult to produce and reading conditions genuinely punishing. At 300 meters, all 7 candidates achieved sub-MOA performance. At 500 meters, the same. At 800 meters, one candidate, Petty Officer First Class Garrett Wynn, dropped 2 shots outside acceptable parameters due to a misjudged wind shift and was allowed a requalification attempt the following morning, which he passed. Ronia, at each distance, shot first among the candidates in her assigned rotation. Sherrick had designed the rotation himself. She was always first, the worst assignment in a variable wind environment because the first shooter establishes the wind read with no prior data from the morning's conditions, shooting into uncertainty while the candidates behind benefit from whatever the first shooter's rounds reveal about the air. This was not an accident. She knew it was not an accident. She set up first, read the wind with her Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter, input her atmospheric data into her Horus H-59 ballistic reticle card, chambered around, and shot. At 800 meters in a 14-knot crosswind that gusted to 19 knots at its peak, she put 5 rounds into a 0.73 MOA group. The target was retrieved and measured by Sherrick's range coordinator, a senior chief named Holloway who had the particular effect of professional neutrality honed by someone who had seen enough to have no remaining opinions about anything. Holloway read the measurement, recorded it on the official form, and moved to the next candidate. Sherrick did not comment on the group. This was notable because he commented on every other candidate's performance, in the manner of a trainer who observed and noted, sometimes approvingly, sometimes correctively, but consistently. For Ronia, there was only the clipboard notation and the silence. She returned to her position and began her weapons check. She had learned to read silence as information. His silence said the same thing it had been saying since she walked through the door. It said, "This doesn't change anything." Drop a comment if you've ever had a moment where your best performance was met with someone refusing to see it. Where you hit every mark perfectly and the person who needed to acknowledge it found a reason to look away. Your story matters. Tell us in the comments. The incident with Derek Turin occurred on the 9th day of the program, a Thursday, during the 1,200-meter qualification sequence. The conditions that morning were challenging in a specific, particularly demanding way. A 17-knot wind running left to right across the firing line, a temperature of 61 degrees Fahrenheit dropping 2 degrees per hour as a marine layer pushed in from the coast, and a sun angle that produced shimmer off the ground between the 800 and 1,000-meter berm that would degrade optical clarity for anyone reading the mirage without the correct filter combination on their scope. Derek Turin was in the rotation behind Velacourt. Turin had been shooting well, his data consistently clean, his wind calls reliable. He had a particular gift for reading mirage. The way the heat waves rose and bent off the ground could tell an experienced shooter precisely how much wind was moving and in what direction. And Turin had an almost intuitive grasp of it that Ronia had noted with the respect she gave genuinely capable people regardless of rank or history. On his third round at 1,200 meters, Turin called a wind correction before firing, then held for a flag shift that arrived late and fired on natural respiratory pause. The round impacted the target's edge, technically within qualification parameters but on the very border. His spotter, Hernandez, gave him the impact call. Turin reloaded and prepared his fourth round. Sherrick walked behind the firing line. He stopped behind Turin. He watched Turin's position for a moment, then made a note on his clipboard. Then he said, at a volume calculated for the adjacent candidates to hear rather than quiet mentorship, Turin, your body position is inconsistent between your first and third rounds. You're anticipating recoil before you fire. I'm seeing the muzzle begin to track down before the shot breaks. Turin's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Master Chief, he said, without moving from his firing position. The flag shifted 4 knots left between my second and third rounds. I adjusted my hold and fired before the natural pause window closed. I didn't ask for your reasoning, Sherrick said. I'm telling you what I'm seeing in your position. I understand that, Master Chief. Turin remained still. I'd respectfully note that my first 3 rounds are within sub-MOA parameters at this distance. It was the word respectfully that cracked the atmosphere. Not because it was provocative, because it was measured. Because a 26-year-old with 18 months in the teams had chosen precision over deference, and in the social architecture of the program, there was a form of challenge that Sherrick could not leave unanswered without the answer looking like weakness. Sherrick stepped forward 1 pace. The sound of the range seemed to contract. You have 2 rounds remaining in your qualification string, he said, his voice going to that specific register of controlled authority that carries threat without requiring threat's explicit vocabulary. I'd suggest you focus on completing your string rather than explaining yourself. From 5 positions down the line, Ronia heard every word. She had already completed her own string. She was documenting her data. Her pencil stopped moving. She understood what was happening. She had seen it before in different institutional settings, different ranks, different faces, but the same architecture. A young operator who was performing correctly. A senior figure with something to prove. An audience of peers. And a mechanism, built from authority and unknown certainty, that was designed not to improve the young operator's performance but to fracture his confidence in front of witnesses. She set down her pencil. She stood. "Master Chief Sherrick," she said, walking toward him with the unhurried pace of someone who had made a decision and was no longer interested in revising it. Her voice was calm the way still water is calm. Not the absence of force but the presence of it, controlled and directional. Every head on the firing line turned. Sherrick turned to look at her. His expression did not change, but his eyes did something that was not visible to anyone more than 6 feet away. A microcontraction. A recalibration. Petty Officer Turin's first 3 rounds are sub-MOA at 1,200 meters in a 17-knot crosswind, she said. She was not loud. She was the opposite of loud. His correction on rounds 2 and 3 was textbook, adjusting for a documented 4-knot flag shift. His body position is consistent across all 3 rounds. I was watching from position 4. She held Sherrick's gaze without aggression, without apology, and without any of the performed deference that the institutional hierarchy expected from someone who was junior to the person she was addressing. He is executing correctly. What I was seeing was solid field technique under variable conditions. The range was silent except for the wind and the distant sound of the Pacific. Sherrick looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then he looked at his clipboard. He made a notation. He turned back to the firing line without addressing either Turin or Ronia directly, and in a voice scraped clean of every register except bureaucratic neutrality, said, "Continue your qualification string, Turin." Turin fired his 4th and 5th rounds. Both were inside the qualification circle. The group measured 0.88 MOA. Sherrick recorded it, said nothing, and moved down the line. Derek Turin did not look at Ronia. He did not need to. He broke down his firing position with precise, mechanical movements, the kind of compose that follows something difficult. And when he finally glanced at her while stowing his data card, his expression carried everything he could not say in that moment in a single, quiet acknowledgement. She nodded once, returned to her position, picked up her pencil. That evening, in the narrow corridor between the equipment room and the candidate's quarters, Gunnery Sergeant Felipe Rask found her. Rask was 44 years old, Army liaison to the program, a broad-shouldered man from Central Texas who wore his experience in the way that some men wear it, as bulk, as precedent, as the expectation that the room would organize itself around his presence. He had been Sherrick's visible enforcer throughout the first 9 days, the man who echoed Sherrick's observations a half-step behind, who laughed at the right moments and recorded things on clipboards that did not technically require recording. He stopped in the corridor and looked at her the way she had been looked at since the first morning. Then he said something she had not expected. "That was a mistake," he said. But his voice did not have the weight of reproach in it. It had the tone of something more complicated. "Not what you did. The way things are going to go now because of it." She waited. Rask looked at the door behind her, then back. "Sherrick filed a performance notation today. Said your intervention on the firing line indicated a pattern of disruptive conduct inconsistent with program protocol." He said it flatly, the way a man reads a weather report he didn't write and doesn't approve of. His using 3.2c of the evaluation charter. That's the subjective conduct clause. She had read the evaluation charter on day 1. She had read all 4 to 7 pages of it. She had specifically noted section 3.2c, which gave the program coordinator authority to assess candidate conduct affecting the program environment as a scored evaluation metric. The clause had no defined parameters. It was, in the language of institutional design, deliberately interpretable. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Rask's jaw tightened. He was a man in the process of deciding something. She could see it. Years of reading people in field environments had given her a particular sensitivity to the specific physiological signals of someone whose internal allegiance was in the act of shifting. The slight downward direction of the gaze. The decreased frequency of micro-expressions. The voice that was slower than its owner intended it to be. "Is going to bring it to the Week 3 review," Rask said. "He has enough discretionary authority under 3.2c to recommend your removal from the program before the long-range phase begins." Long-range phase. The words landed with specific gravity. The long-range phase of the program was its entire purpose. Everything before it was preamble. Known distance qualification was verification of capability. The long-range phase was the reason a retired 3-star general had signed an authorization. It was the reason the program existed. And it was the phase that Ronia had been preparing for, in the most meaningful sense, since a dying man had placed a rifle case in her hands and told her she could do what no one believed she could do. She looked at Rask for a moment. "What's the current weather forecast for the Yuma Range in week 4? She asked. Rask blinked. The question had dismantled whatever architecture of warning he had constructed for this conversation. "What?" "The long-range evaluation range in Yuma," she said. "What's the forecast for week 4? He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then something very nearly like the beginning of a different expression crossed his face. Not quite respect. Something in its direction. Hot. Afternoon thermals. Variable crosswind 8 to 22 knots. She nodded. "I'll need to adjust my dope for the elevation change from coastal to desert air. 714 feet above sea level at the Yuma Range versus 12 feet here." Rask looked at her for a long moment. "You said you don't belong here," he said quietly. Not as accusation, as information. She picked up the rifle case from where it rested against the wall. The tag with her name swung once on its lanyard. "I know," she said. "He's been wrong about that since day one." She carried the case into the equipment room and closed the door. By the end of the second week, the program had settled into its fault lines with a clean geometric certainty of tectonic plates. On one side, Sherrick, Velacourt, and the comfortable machinery of institutional belonging. 6 men with shared histories, shared vocabulary, shared assumptions about who belonged in what rooms. On the other, Ronia, Turin, and an increasingly visible space that Hernandez and Park were navigating with a careful political awareness of men who understood that fence-sitting was its own form of commitment. The 1,500-meter qualification occurred on day 12, under conditions that required every candidate to bring their complete technical capability to bear. The morning temperature was 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind was 13 knots from the northwest, running oblique to the firing line at a 34-degree angle, which required a complex wind call that could not be simplified to a single correction but had to be resolved through actual trigonometric computation applied to a firing solution. The marine layer produced a light, diffuse overcast that eliminated the visual mirage Turin excelled at reading, requiring everyone to rely purely on instrumental data. Velacourt was regarded as the program's benchmark shooter. His records were real, his experience was genuine, and he carried himself with a particular confidence of a man who had been told by enough people over enough years that he was exceptional. He was not arrogant in the way that weak people are arrogant. He was simply very good, and he knew it, and the knowledge had become so integrated into his identity that he no longer distinguished between the quality of his work and the quality of himself. At 1,500 meters, Velacourt put 5 rounds into a 1.12 MOA group. It was a solid performance. It drew nods from Sherrick, a notation that was not disapproving, and a measured acknowledgement of the peer group. Ronia fired immediately after him. The wind shifted during her preparation, a 6-knot increase in the oblique component that required her to recompute her wind hold with a new correction of 0.83 milliradians from her original firing solution. She performed the computation in 37 seconds by hand on her data card, input the correction into her reticle, and fired. 5 rounds. 0.61 MOA. The target came back. Holloway measured it, recorded it, said nothing. Velacourt was standing 6 feet away. He looked at the target. He looked at the measurement. He looked at his own target for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quite anger and not quite respect. Something unsettled, like a man whose internal landscape had just changed topography without his permission. Sherrick looked at the measurement on Holloway's recording sheet. His expression did not change. He walked past the target without comment. That evening, the Week 2 Administrative Review produced Ronia's first formal evaluation notation. Sherrick had used Section 3.2 C. The notation, which she read through in the quiet of the equipment room at 2,140 hours, characterized her conduct on the firing line during the Turin incident as constituting unsolicited interference with program instruction, incompatible with the collaborative operational culture the program sought to develop. It recommended a formal review of her continued program participation to be conducted at the Week 3 checkpoint. She read it twice, set it down, opened the rifle case. Inside, beneath the foam padding that cradled the TAC-50A1's receiver and bolt assembly and the individually wrapped Schmidt and bendoscope, there was a small brass cylinder. A spent casing, .50 BMG, head stamped with a date 18 years old. The first round Isaiah Morales had ever fired at a target beyond 2,000 meters. He had hit that target, a 24-inch steel plate at 2,143 meters in a training exercise outside Fort Bragg, on his third round. He had kept that first casing in his shirt pocket for 14 years until the cancer in his lungs made holding things difficult, and then he had put it in the bottom of a rifle case along with a folded piece of paper that said only, in his cramped, precise handwriting, "The distance is already there. You just have to decide to cross it." She held the casing in her palm. Its weight was negligible, 11 grams of brass, hollowed and spent. It weighed nothing, and everything. She sat on the equipment room floor with the case open beside her, and she thought about what came next with the same focused, cold attention she gave to a long-range ballistic problem. Variables, known factors, unknowns, corrections available and corrections not available. What she could control, what she could not. She could not control Sherrick's notation. She could not control the Week 3 review. She could not control the institutional machinery that had been running long before she arrived and would run long after she was gone. She could not change the fact that 14 of the last 17 candidates recommended for removal from JLAPAP under Section 3.2c had been removed without a successful appeal. She had found that statistic in the program's own historical documentation, which was technically accessible to all candidates through the shared administrative server, and which she had read the evening before in its entirety. What she could control was the work, the data, the shooting. She could put a round where it was mathematically required to go, under conditions that were objectively punishing, at distances that most people in this building did not believe were achievable by any operator who had not spent a decade doing nothing else. She had spent 11 years doing nothing else. She placed the brass casing back in the foam, closed the case, stood, turned off the light. Before we get to what happens in Week 3, drop a comment below if this story is hitting something in you. Maybe a memory of a room where someone with authority decided you were the problem before you'd had a chance to prove otherwise. Maybe you fought back. Maybe you didn't. Either way, we want to hear from you. Your experience in those comments might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. The Week 3 checkpoint review was held at 0900 on a Tuesday in Building 12, a functional, lightless conference room that smelled of recycled air and the particular bureaucratic neutrality of rooms designed for decisions that leave no visible marks. Rear Admiral Thomas Wexfield was not present. He was in Washington for a defense procurement hearing. The review board consisted of Sherrick, Senior Chief Holloway as Program Evaluator, and a Navy JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Patricia Delano, who had been assigned to ensure procedural compliance with the Evaluation Charter's Conduct Clause provisions. Ronia sat across the table from them in her dress uniform. She had prepared documentation. She had organized it with the same precision she brought to her firing data cards. 11 pages. Tabbed. Cross-referenced. She placed it on the table before her without distributing it. Sherrick opened the review. He was precise, formal, and thorough. He presented the 3.2c notation with its supporting reasoning. He referenced the Turin incident. He referenced 2 other interactions during the previous 14 days that he characterized as patterns, both of which Ronia had prepared counter-documentation for. Lieutenant Commander Delano, who had the particular quality of institutional fairness that produces neither warmth nor hostility, but only a consistent, procedural attentiveness, listened to Sherrick's presentation without expression. Then she turned to Ronia. "Chief Petty Officer Caldwell, you have an opportunity to respond." Ronia placed the 11-page document on the table and slid a copy to each board member. "I'd like to address the 3.2c conduct notation and the specific incident cited," she said. beginning with the factual record of my performance evaluations to date, followed by the documented context of each incident and the relevant section of the program charter that governs the conduct in question. Sherrick looked at the document. He looked at Delano. He looked back at the document. He had not expected 11 pages. She walked the board through each incident methodically. The firing line intervention during Turin's qualification string. She produced a copy of the program's own mentorship and peer instruction provision under Section 2.4F, which explicitly authorized senior qualified candidate to provide technical observation during qualification strings when the primary instructor was not in direct contact position with the candidate being evaluated. Sherrick had been standing 7 feet behind Turin. Under program charter, his position did not constitute a direct contact position as defined in Section 1.8b. The second incident, which Sherrick had characterized as Ronnie failing to follow coordinator instruction during a range logistics sequence, turned out, when examined against the actual sequence of events documented in Holloway's own range log, to be a situation where Ronnie had followed a directive that conflicted with a safety protocol, and the safety protocol had taken precedence. She had the safety protocol page and the relevant naval firearms handling regulation both tabbed and highlighted. The third incident had not happened on a date Sherrick had cited. Holloway's range log, which Ronnie had been given access to along with all other candidates, showed that on the date in question, she had been in a scheduled equipment maintenance session during the window Sherrick referenced. Lieutenant Commander Delano made notes through all of it. When Ronnie finished, Delano looked at Sherrick. "Master Chief, would you like to respond to the documentation presented?" Sherrick's jaw was doing something quiet and controlled. "The documentation addresses the technical procedures," he said. "The conduct notation is based on my evaluation of the program environment and operational culture compatibility, which is within my discretionary authority under 3.2c. It is," Delano said. "However, 3.2c requires the notation to include at least one specific documented behavioral incident in support of its evaluation. Chief Petty Officer Caldwell has offered counter-documentation for all 3 incidents cited. If the documented record does not support the incidents as characterized, the notation cannot be sustained procedurally." She paused. "Unless you have additional supporting documentation." Sherrick looked at the table. Holloway had been quiet for the entire proceeding. He was a man who had catalogued enough of the world to have made his peace with most of it, and he recorded things on clipboards with the fidelity of someone who understood that accurate records are the only honest thing an organization can produce. He looked at his range log. He looked at Sherrick. He said nothing, which was itself a very specific form of saying something. Delano closed a notebook. "I'll note for the record that the 3.2c notation does not meet the procedural evidentiary standard for formal review recommendation. Chief Petty Officer Caldwell will continue in the program." She looked at Ronnie. "Thank you for your thorough preparation." Ronnie gathered her documents. She thanked the board. She walked out of Building 12 into the February sunshine, and the salt air came off the Pacific, and the BUDOS candidates were jogging along the beach road again, their silhouettes precise and exhausted, their breath in white clouds. She did not smile. There was nothing to smile about yet. She had survived a procedural challenge that should never have been brought. She had used 11 pages and 4 hours of preparation to preserve her right to remain in a program she had been legitimately selected for. Sherrick was still the program coordinator. The long-range phase was still 2 weeks away. The 4,000-meter evaluation range near Yuma was still waiting. And whatever the Week 3 review had produced on paper, the fundamental architecture of the problem had not changed. She walked back toward the equipment room. She had rounds to check and data to update and a ballistic solution to calculate for a desert range at 714 feet above sea level in variable crosswind conditions between 8 and 22 knots. The work was what remained. The work was always what remained. Tell us in the comments what you're thinking right now. If this story is pulling at something, if it reminds you of someone you know or something you've been through, we want to hear it. Drop your thoughts below. Someone watching this right now might need to read exactly what you have to say. The notice arrived 12 days before the long-range phase was scheduled to begin at the Yuma Proving Ground Precision Fire Evaluation Range. It came through the standard administrative routing chain, addressed to all JLPAP DET-1 candidates, and it carried a header that changed the nature of everything. Office of Rear Admiral Thomas L. Wexfield, NSW Command. Rear Admiral Wexfield, it stated, would be personally attending the long-range phase evaluation at the Yuma Range. The reason given was program oversight and command interest in the output data. But the actual reason, which moved through the facility's informal information channels with the speed of anything that carries genuine consequence, was that a senior defense official had flagged the JLPAP program for potential citation in an upcoming congressional briefing on Special Operations Precision Capability, and Wexfield needed to be present when the numbers were produced. He was bringing, the notice further stated, a general officer, Army, 3-star. The general's name was listed as Lieutenant General Marcus Dre, Director of Joint Special Operations Command's Capability Development Office. General Dre was, by all accounts available in the facility's informal information network, a man who had come up through Army Ranger and Special Forces channels, who had spent 31 years in close proximity to the best shooters the American military had ever produced, and who had, at a previous joint evaluation 9 years ago, reportedly walked off a firing range when a sniper demonstration failed to meet standards he considered operationally relevant. He was not a man who attended things as an audience. He was a man who attended things as a verdict. The news of Wexfield and Dre's attendance spread through the facility with a particular electrical quality, the kind of energy produced when stakes of a different magnitude enter a space already running hot. Velacourt, who had been the program's presumptive standard-bearer since day one, was noticeably quieter over the following 48 hours. The two candidates who had been keeping their heads down, Hernandez and Park, began shooting earlier and staying later in their preparation sessions. Sherrick called a full program session on the evening the notice arrived. He stood at the front of the briefing room in a way that used all of him, every year of rank and institutional authority pressed into the particular posture of a man reasserting the shape of his domain. He reviewed the Yuma Range specifications, the evaluation sequence, the scoring criteria. He discussed the role of the command visit in program documentation. He said all the correct things about performance and preparation and representing Naval Special Warfighter Command with distinction. He did not look at Ronia during any of it. She looked at him. She had a data card in front of her and a pencil in her hand, and she made notes with the steady, precise attention of someone who was not thinking about what he was saying but about what it meant that he was no longer looking at her. He had shifted his strategy. She could feel it the way she could feel a wind shift on the range, not visible yet, not measurable yet, but present in the pressure of the air. He was no longer trying to remove her from the program. He was doing something more sophisticated. He was preparing for the Yuma Range with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the long-range phase would handle the problem for him. He believed she would fail. He had believed it since the morning she walked through the gate carrying a dead man's rifle case. He believed it still, despite 11 pages of counter-documentation and a 0.61 MOA group at 1,500 meters in a 13-knot oblique crosswind. He believed it with the specific certainty of someone whose entire experience of the world had never genuinely required him to revise the belief. That evening, Ronia returned to the equipment room after the briefing and opened the rifle case. She removed the TAC-50A1 from its foam, unfolded her cleaning kit, and began a detailed service of the bolt assembly. The process was methodical and familiar, and she performed it with the focused quiet of someone praying in a language that had no words. The bolt head, the extractor, the firing pin assembly, the chamber and the throat, the crown, the Schmidt and Bender optic, each lens surface checked with lens tissue and diffuse light, the internal adjustment turrets verified for zero confirmation against her log data, the trigger assembly, which she had modified herself over a period of 14 months, its pull weight sitting at exactly 2.3 pounds with a crisp, glass rod brake that Isaiah Morales had told her was the most important single factor in extreme long-range precision. A clean trigger on a clean system in clean air, he had said, can reach distances that the math tells you are unreasonable. Don't fight the math. Work the variables the math doesn't know about yet. She finished the service at 2,213 hours. She replaced the bolt assembly. She settled the rifle back into its foam. She looked at the brass casing in its corner of the case for a moment. Then she closed the case, turned off the light, and went to prepare for the next morning's session. The Yuma Range was 3 days away, and everything that had happened in the previous 3 weeks, every notation and dismissal and procedural maneuver and institutional silence, all of it had been preamble. All of it had been the terrain before the actual distance. The distance was still out there, waiting. She was not afraid of distances. The convoy from Coronado to the Yuma Proving Ground took 4 hours and 17 minutes through the desert interior of Southern California and across the Arizona state line. 2 government vehicles carrying 7 candidates, their equipment cases, and the particular compressed silence of people approaching something they could not fully predict. The landscape changed by degrees, coastal sage scrub giving way to high chaparral and then to the open flat of the Sonoran Desert, the horizon pulling back until the sky became the dominant fact of the world, enormous and pale blue and indifferent to everything moving beneath it. Ronia sat in the rear seat of the second vehicle and watched the desert with the steady attention she gave to everything that carried information. The air changed as they drove east. The coast's salt and weight disappeared, and in its place came the dry, alkaline clarity of desert air, thinner and more honest in the way that desert air is always more honest, stripping away everything that isn't essential and leaving only what remains. She felt the elevation shift somewhat past El Centro, the atmospheric pressure dropping in increments her body registered before her orchestral meter confirmed it. 714 feet. She had calculated her firing solution for this elevation 11 times over the preceding week, using 3 different ballistic software programs and then running the equations by hand to verify. The numbers each time were the same. What the numbers did not tell her, what no calculation could fully account for, was the desert thermal activity that would build through the afternoon, heat rising off the baked gravel plain in columns that could deflect a bullet's path at extreme range by measurements that the textbooks described as significant and that experienced desert shooters described in considerably more personal terms. If you're still with us at this point in the story, drop a comment and let us know. Tell us what pulled you in. Was it the distance she was preparing to cross? Or was it something else, something closer to home? Something about the way she kept walking forward even when the path was being made deliberately difficult. The Yuma Proving Grounds Precision Fire Evaluation Range sat at the southeastern edge of the installation, separated from the main facility by 11 miles of access road that crossed 2 dry arroyos and a section of scrubland where the Joshua trees had been growing since before the base existed. The range itself was a long, engineered corridor of hard-packed desert floor, precisely leveled by Army Corps topographers who had spent 4 days with GPS survey equipment ensuring that every 100-meter interval from the firing line to the 4,000-meter target BAM was documented to within 6 inches of accuracy. Steel target frames were positioned at the 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, and 2,500-meter marks as intermediate reference points. The final target, a 36-inch circular steel plate mounted on a ground-level frame at 4,000 meters, was not visible from the firing line with the naked eye. It was a theoretical object, a mathematical destination. The candidates arrived at 1,140 hours. The sky was cloudless at a February temperature of 74 degrees Fahrenheit, unusual for the month, a warm front having pushed through the previous day and left the desert floor radiating stored heat like something alive. By mid-afternoon, the thermal columns would be producing the shimmer that turned distant objects into liquid geometry. Master Chief Sherrick was already at the range when the convoy arrived. He had driven out the previous evening to conduct a coordination meeting with the range safety officers and to review the target confirmation setup. He met the candidates at the vehicle staging area with his clipboard and a face that gave nothing away. "Gear staged in 30 minutes, he said. "Formal evaluation briefing at 1300. Command element arrives at 14:15. He paused. "I want everyone presentable and prepared." He walked through the group without looking at Ronia. She carried her rifle case to the staging area and began setting up her firing position without ceremony. The command element arrived at 1,407 hours, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, in 3 vehicles that carried Rear Admiral Thomas Wexfield, Lieutenant General Marcus Dre, 2 aides, a program documentation officer, and a defense contractor representative whose presence no one formally explained. Wexfield was 63, silver-haired, and moved with the particular economy of command that suggested he had been in charge of rooms his entire adult life and had long since stopped finding it interesting. Dre was different. He was 58, still physically compact in the way of someone who had never fully retired from the physical habits of a combat career, with a face like weathered topography and eyes that moved across the range with quick, specific interest. Dre looked at the range. He looked at the 4,000-meter target berm, invisible to the naked eye but marked on the range diagram pinned to the briefing board. He looked at the firing positions. He looked at the 7 candidates. He stopped looking for approximately 2 seconds when he reached Ronia. Not the 2-second dismissal she had received from Sherrick on the first morning. A different 2 seconds. The kind produced by someone who was genuinely processing new information and revising an existing picture. He said nothing. He moved on to the briefing board. Sherrick conducted the formal evaluation briefing with meticulous precision. The program's parameters, the scoring methodology, the safety protocols for a 4,000-meter range corridor, the wind flag positions at the 500, 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000-meter marks, the spotting scope teams positioned at the 3,500-meter berm for impact confirmation. He covered each element in the correct order and at the correct level of detail. He was, technically speaking, an excellent program coordinator. Wexfield listened and occasionally made notes. Dre watched the range. When Sherrick finished, Dre asked 2 questions. The first was about the target size, which he noted was 36 inches in diameter. That's a generous target for an extreme long-range evaluation, he said. Not critically, observationally. Sherrick agreed that it was generous, noting that at 4,000 meters, even a 36-inch target represented a fraction of milliradian angular size that made consistent hits an extreme technical achievement. Dre nodded. He asked his second question. Has anyone on this program ever put a round on that target? Sherrick was quiet for a fraction of a second. The 4,000-meter position is a demonstration objective, he said. The formal qualification standard tops at 2,500 meters. I know what the qualification standard is, Dre said. The range was very quiet. A wind flag at the 500-meter mark moved left in a 9-knot gust, then fell still. I'm asking whether anyone here has hit the target. Today's session will include an attempt on the 4,000-meter position, Sherrick said. Good, said Dre. He looked at the target beam again. Let's see it. Drop a comment if the hair on your arms just stood up, because they were about to find out something that only a very small number of people in the world understood about that range, about that distance, and about the woman standing at the far end of the staging area with a rifle case that weighed more than the sum of its parts. The formal evaluation sequence proceeded through the afternoon in the orderly fashion Sherrick had designed. Known distance confirmation at 500, 1,000, and 1,500 meters. Each candidate required to produce a 3-round group within program parameters functioned as the baseline verification. All 7 candidates performed within acceptable ranges. By 1530 hours, the sun had dropped to a position that cut glare to a manageable level, and the thermal activity off the desert floor had settled from its afternoon peak into a slower, more readable shimmer. At 1545, the evaluation moved to the 2,000-meter target. At 2,000 meters, Velacourt produced his best single performance of the entire program. 3 rounds in a 0.94 MOA group at the very edge of what was considered genuinely remarkable at that distance. Sherrick observed it with visible approval. General Dre watched through a spotting scope without comment. Ronia, firing in her assigned rotation position, produced 3 rounds at 2,000 meters in a 0.79 MOA group. Holloway measured and recorded. The range documentation officer captured the data. Dre, who had moved behind the firing line, watched through the spotting scope when her shots impacted and held the scope for a moment after the 3rd round. He said nothing. The 2,500-meter target was the final formally scheduled evaluation position. At 2,500 meters, the program's precision standard was defined as a confirmed hit within the 24-inch scoring ring, a threshold that, at this distance, represented extraordinary technical ability. The wind had come up again, a variable desert afternoon pattern running 11 to 17 knots from the southwest shifting direction by 8 to 12 degrees in irregular cycles that required every shooter to make real-time calls rather than relying on a stable baseline correction. Petty Officer First Class Garrett when hit the 24-inch scoring ring on his second round. Hernandez hit it on his first. Park hit it on his first. Velacourt hit it on his first and fired a second round that impacted within 3 inches of the first, which drew an audible acknowledgement from Wexfield. Derek Turin hit the 24-inch ring on his first round and then, on his second, placed the bullet inside the 12-inch inner circle. He held his firing position for a moment after the spotting call came through, then extracted the empty casing with the steady deliberateness of someone who had just confirmed something about himself that he had not been completely sure of before. Ronia fired her first round. Hit. Spotting team reported the impact at 8 inches from center. She fired her second round. Impact, 6.3 inches from center. Third round, 4.7 inches from center. General Dre had the spotting scope to his eye for all 3 of those impacts. He lowered it very slowly after the third. He looked at Rear Admiral Wexfield. Wexfield was looking at the Range Documentation Officer's data sheet. Something communicated between the 2 flag officers that required no words. The particular exchange between senior people who have seen enough to know what a number means. Sherrick was looking at the firing line. He had his clipboard. He made a notation. His face was doing something controlled and specific. The expression of a man who has constructed a building over a very long time and is detecting, for the first time, a foundational problem he did not engineer and cannot immediately address. It was Dre who asked. He did it simply, with the directness of someone who had no interest in the social architecture of the moment and a great deal of interest in what the range could tell him. He turned toward the firing positions and said, to no one specifically and therefore to everyone present, the 4,000-meter target. I want to see it attempted. Sherrick stepped forward. General, the formal evaluation program concludes at 2,500 meters. The 4,000-meter target position is a demonstration objective. Today's curriculum has been designed to. I understand the curriculum, Dre said. Not unkindly, not particularly gently. I want to see the 4,000-meter target attempted. If anyone here can put a round on it, I want to know. He looked at the firing line. Who's trying first? This was the moment. Not the moment of the shot. The moment before the moment of the shot. The moment when the room decides its own shape. Velacourt stepped forward. He said, with the clean confidence of his history, I'll go, sir. And in his voice there was no performance, only the genuine self-assurance of a man who was very good at his work and understood this to be the moment that work had been building toward. He set up at the firing position. His spotter, a range team member positioned at 3,500 meters, confirmed communications. Velacourt loaded. He read his kestrel meter. He made his calculations. He fired. The round traveled for 5.7 seconds. It impacted 4.3 meters short and 1.2 meters right of the target. He reloaded. He adjusted his firing solution. He fired again. 3.1 meters short. 0.8 meters right. Third round. The wind shifted during bullet flight, a Sonoran desert gust that arrived at the 2,500-meter point 19 seconds after Velacourt's kestrel red had stabilized his solution. The round impacted 6.7 meters left of the target. Fourth round, fifth round, 2.9 meters short, 1.1 meters right. 4.1 meters left, 2.3 meters short. Velacourt stood. He broke down his position without expression. He had not hit the target. 5 rounds. 5 misses. Dre watched each impact through the communication feed from the 3,500-meter spotting team. He said nothing. One by one, the other candidates took the position. Garrett win, 4 rounds. Closest impact 2.2 meters from the target edge. Hernandez, 3 rounds. 1 impact 3.1 meters short, 2 wide. Park, 5 rounds, all outside the 3-meter radius. Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Mercer, the 6th candidate, a shooter with 2 confirmed long-range records in his unit history. 6 rounds, closest impact 1.8 meters from the target. Then Derek Turin. He set up with the quiet precision he had been demonstrating since the first day, inputting his data with methodical care, calling to his spotter for 2 wind flag reads before chambering. He fired his first round and heard from the spotting team, 1.4 meters right, 0.6 meters high. The closest anyone had come. He adjusted, fired again. 0.9 meters left. Adjusted. Third round, 1.1 meters right. The wind was doing something complex in the thermal layer between 2,500 and 3,500 meters, the kind of layered, variable pattern that could not be resolved from a single point of atmospheric measurement and required either multiple readings from different positions or something else entirely. He fired his 4th and 5th rounds. Neither hit. He stood. He looked at the target berm for a moment. 13 rounds had been fired at the 4,000-meter target by 6 different operators, 6 men with genuine credentials and real ability, and between them representing several decades of precision fire experience. 13 rounds. 13 misses. General Dre looked at the range. Then he looked at the remaining candidate, the one who had not yet taken a firing position, the one who was standing at the far right of the staging area with a rifle case at her feet and a data card in her hand. Chief Petty Officer Caldwell, he said. The sound of her name in his voice carried a quality she had never heard before in this institutional context. Not special accommodation, not performative inclusion, but the simple, flat directness of a 3-star general who had just watched 13 rounds fail at a target and was looking at the person who had been producing the best numbers all day. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. If you've ever watched someone be the last one asked, the one they got to only after everyone else had tried and fallen short, then you know what the air felt like on that firing line right now. Drop a comment. Tell us what went through your mind in this moment. Tell us what you were hoping for. Ronia did not move immediately. She stood at the staging area for a moment, looking at the target berm. She was not processing the question. She had been processing the question for 3 weeks, in the form of data cards and firing solutions and the patient construction of a ballistic answer to a mathematical problem that most people in this building had not yet accepted as solvable. She picked up the case. She walked to the firing position. She set up without ceremony. The process of establishing her firing position was not theatrical. It was methodical and precise and completely without performance, the way any serious technical work is performed when the person doing it cares more about the outcome than the appearance. She unfolded her shooting mat at the position, a 62-inch padded platform that she had positioned at a specific angle to the firing lane, 4 degrees left of the direct centerline, accounting for the Coriolis effect's rightward drift on a bullet traveling north-northwest in the northern hemisphere over a 5.7-second flight path. She had calculated that drift at 4,000 meters as 0.43 meters right, a number that did not appear in any standard firing solution chart, and that she had derived from first principles using the Iot-Vos correction formula applied to her specific geographic position and azimuth. Rask, standing behind the firing line, watched her set up. He watched her angle adjustment. He looked at Sherrick. Sherrick was watching too. His expression was no longer the controlled neutral of professional evaluation. It was something thinner, something that had the shape of a man who was beginning to understand that the architecture of this moment was not built the way he had assumed. Ronia placed the TAC-50A1 on its bipod. She removed the suppressor from its foam padding and threaded it onto the barrel crown with 12 precise turns, checking the alignment with a tool that she had machined herself to verify concentricity to within 0.001 inches. A non-concentric suppressor at this distance would add baffle strike harmonics that could deflect point of impact by as much as 0.4 milliradians. At 4,000 meters, 0.4 milliradians was 1.6 meters. She verified the suppressor twice. She settled the Schmidt and Bender 5-25x56 PMII scope's power ring at 25 magnification. At this magnification, the 36-inch target at 4,000 meters would appear through the optic as an object approximately the size of a dime at arm's length. She had the Schmidt and Bender's elevation turret pre-dialed to her starting position based on her solution, a total correction of 98.4 milliradians of elevation above her zero, the maximum useful range of the turret's adjustment, which she had verified against the turret's mechanical stop the previous evening in the Yuma equipment room. She reached into the pouch on her shooting mat and produced her data card. It was covered in small, precise handwriting, the product of 11 separate calculation sessions, each one approaching the same problem from a slightly different angle to verify convergence. The final solution was outlined in red pen at the bottom of the card, boxed. Elevation, 98.4 milliradians above zero. Windage, 8.3 milliradians left, baseline. Variable component 0 to 3.1 milliradians right depending on thermal column timing. Coriolis and spin drift combined. 0.43 meters right compensation built into body position angle. Temperature correction, plus 0.7% velocity increase from standard load data, compensated in elevation figure. Atmospheric density at 714 feet, 0.6% higher A density than sea level calculation, compensated. Bullet flight time estimated, 5.71 seconds. She looked at the wind flags. The 500-meter flag was showing 9 knots, running left to right. The 1,000-meter flag, 11 knots, same direction. The 2,000-meter flag, 8 knots, with a slight directional variance of approximately 7 degrees northeast. The 3,000-meter flag, no movement. Still, the 3,000-meter flag was still. She read that stillness and understood its meaning immediately. In the desert thermal pattern she had been observing for the previous 3 hours, the 3,000-meter zone went still in the minutes immediately preceding a gust cycle. The stillness was not absence of wind. It was a holding of breath before the exhale. She had 2 minutes, possibly 3, before the next gust cycle would push through the 3,000-meter mark and create the laid variable pattern that had undone every shooter before her. She loaded a single round of Hornady .50 BMG AMAX, 750 grain, from the 10-round bag she had carried from Coronado and kept in the foam of the rifle case at a constant temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure consistent powder performance. The round seated with its characteristic solid click. She closed the bolt. She communicated to the spotting team at 3,500 meters. Stand by for first round. Request impact confirmation immediate on impact. She settled her cheek onto the comb of the stock. The stock's comb height she had adjusted 4 weeks ago to position her eye at the exact optical axis of the Schmidt and Bender, eliminating the scope shadow that indicates a non-centered eye position and can introduce parallax error that at 4,000 meters becomes a measurement in meters rather than millimeters. Through the scope, the desert was a landscape of compressed distance. The 1,000-meter target berm appeared as a nearby object. The 2,000-meter berm beyond it, smaller. The 3,000-meter reference marker, smaller still. And beyond it, at the theoretical edge of what the optic could resolve with clarity, there was the target berm. She could see the steel frame. She could, at 25 magnification, make out the circular target. It appeared the size of a shirt button at the end of a dark room. She applied 2.3 pounds of pressure to the trigger assembly, feeling it travel through the first stage of its pull and settle at the wall. Her right-hand trigger finger found the wall and rested there. She breathed. This was the part that no calculation addressed. This was where everything else fell away, the notations and the procedural challenges and the 40-minute equipment inspections and the 2-second of dismissal at the briefing room door and all the weight of everything that a closed institution could deploy against a person it had decided did not belong. All of it reduced to one thing. One variable. The last variable. The one that lived not in the data card or the elevation turret or the atmospheric meter, but in the space between her breath out and her breath in the 0.4 seconds of natural respiratory pause when the body is most still and the body's own tremor is at its minimum frequency and the cross-haze are as quiet as they are ever going to be. She watched the 3,000-meter flag. Still, still, still. She pressed through the wall. The trigger broke at 2.3 pounds with the clean, instant release she had spent 14 months engineering into the assembly. No creep, no warning. Only the sudden fire of a cartridge containing 237 grains of propellant behind a 750-grain projectile leaving the barrel at 2,887 feet per second. The recoil was substantial, a controlled shove of a 26-pound rifle pushed back into her shoulder by the physics of Newtonian mechanics, and the suppressor reduced the muzzle signature to something still enormous but directional, throwing the sound away from the firing line. The round was in flight. 5.7 seconds. Nobody moved. The desert was completely still. The wind flags hung motionless. The thermal column above the 3,000-meter mark had not yet moved. Dre had the spotting scope pressed to his eye. Wexfield was standing 2 feet behind him and had said nothing for 4 minutes. Sherrick was holding his clipboard at his side and not writing anything. Turin was watching the target burn with his naked eye, which could not resolve the target at this distance. But he was watching in the direction of the thing that mattered, which was itself a form of faith. Rask was watching Ronnia. 5 seconds. 5.2. 5.4. 5.6. The spotting team's radio crackled. The voice of the 3,500-meter spotter, a range technician named Corporal Labora who had spent 6 years working extreme long-range confirmation and who had delivered dozens of impact reports in his career with the flat, factual effect of professional neutrality, came through the radio with a tone that was professional and flat and also contained something that his professionalism was not quite large enough to fully contain. Impact confirmed, he said. Center of target. Estimate 3 to 4 inches from geometric center. Nobody moved. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then General Marcus Dre, Lieutenant General, United States Army, 31 years of proximity to the best precision shooters the American military had ever produced, lowered the spotting scope from his eye. He looked at it for a moment as if verifying that it was the same instrument he had been using all afternoon. Then he looked at the target boom, invisible from his position but now carrying a different kind of weight in the desert air, the weight of something having happened out there that had not happened in 13 previous attempts. He looked at Ronnia Caldwell. She was still in her firing position. The rifle's bolts cycled back and the empty brass casing ejected onto the mat beside her. She was reading her data card. She was, with the absolute focused composure of someone who was not finished, not performing triumph, not looking at anyone in the staging area, but applying what she had learned from the first round's impact point to the correction needed for the second round. She loaded round 2. She fired. Corporal Labora's radio. Impact confirmed. Center ring. Estimate 2 inches from geometric center. Round 3. Flight time 5.71 seconds. Impact confirmed. Inside the 6-inch inner circle. Approximately 1.5 inches from geometric center. The range had the quality of a space that has just had all its sound removed and is deciding whether to refill it. Turin turned away from the target boom. He was pressing his lips together, and his jaw was tight, and he was doing the particular thing that people do in military environments when something moves them and the environment requires that movement to be invisible. Rask set down his clipboard. He set it down on the ground beside him, not on the table, not on the vehicle, on the ground, and he did not pick it up again. Velicourt was standing very still. He was looking at the range data in Holloway's recording sheet. His face had undergone a significant restructuring since the spotting team's first confirmation, not the unsettled quality she had noticed in him at the 1,500-meter stage, but something more complete. Something that happens when a person's internal narrative about the shape of the world is revised by a number that the narrative did not account for. Sherrick had not moved. He was still holding the clipboard. He was still standing where he had been standing. But the thing he had been holding in his posture, the compressed institutional certainty, the weight of 23 years of unchallenged authority over who belonged in these rooms and what they were capable of, that thing had changed its quality without changing its outward shape. It was the way a structure looks the same from a distance in the seconds after the foundation has shifted. Drop a comment right now if you felt what just happened. If the weight of it landed on you. 3 rounds. 3 impacts inside the center ring at 4,000 meters. After 13 misses by 6 credentialed operators. Drop a comment and tell us what you're feeling because this moment deserves to be spoken out loud. Rear Admiral Wexfield turned to Sherrick. His voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that flag officers use when they have something to say that requires its own space. Master Chief Sherrick, I'm going to want to review the program evaluation documentation. All of it, including the conduct notations. Sherrick's jaw tightened. Admiral. All of it, Wexfield said again. The second time he said it, the phrase carried a different weight, not repetition for emphasis but clarification of scope. Dre had walked to the firing line while this exchange occurred. He stood beside Ronnia's position as she was breaking down the TAC-50A1, working methodically through the post-firing sequence with the same focused attention she had brought to the entire day. He watched her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "How long have you been shooting extreme long range?" She looked up. 11 years, sir." "Who trained you?" "Retired Chief Warrant Officer Isaiah Morales. He was assigned to NSW Special Operations Training Group from 2007 to 2015. Dre was quiet for a moment. He appeared to be retrieving something from a significant depth of memory. "Isaiah Morales," he said. "Not a question." "You knew him?" she asked. "I watched him hit a 2,400-meter target from a moving vehicle platform in a joint exercise in 2011, Dre said. "I thought it was a fluke. He hit it again. Then a third time." He paused. "I told him he was wasting himself as an advisor. He said he wasn't advising operators. He was building one." Something crossed the general's face that had the character of a man completing a sentence that had been interrupted 13 years ago. "I assumed he meant a man." Ronnie set the bolt assembly into its foam slot. She looked at the rifle case for a moment. "He didn't," she said. Dre looked at the case. Then at her. "No," he said. "Clearly he didn't." The formal documentation review that Wexfield had requested began that same evening, conducted in the Yuma Range Administrative Facility with Wexfield's aide, Lieutenant Commander Delano, who had been traveling with the command element, and a JAG representative who had been on standby for command compliance matters. They pulled Holloway's range logs, the program evaluation records, all 7 candidates' performance data, and the administrative documentation that included Sheriff Section 3.2, C, Conduct Notation and the Week 3 review proceedings. Holloway cooperated completely. His range logs were meticulous, as they always were, because Holloway recorded things with fidelity the way some men build walls, not for anyone else's benefit, but because the alternative was a world without accurate records, and Holloway found that world unacceptable. His logs showed, without editorializing, what they showed. A candidate whose performance data from day one was consistently at or above the program's highest-performing male candidates, paired with a conduct notation whose documented evidentiary basis did not survive procedural scrutiny. Rask, when asked by Wexfield's aide to provide a characterization of the program environment as the Joint Liaison Officer, provided one. He provided it in the quiet, deliberate way of a man who had been holding something for several weeks and had decided, on a desert firing line that afternoon, that he was no longer willing to carry it. He did not elaborate beyond what was asked. He did not perform. He simply answered the questions with the same factual directness that Holloway's logs had demonstrated, and the picture that emerged from his answers, placed beside the logs and the evaluation data, was coherent and detailed and entirely damning. Velicourt was not asked. He was not needed. The documentation was sufficient. Sherrick submitted his administrative response to the documentation review 2 days later, in writing, from the facility's administrative office. It was 3 pages and technically competent and defended his evaluation decisions on the basis of program coordinated discretionary authority. Lieutenant Commander Delano reviewed it in conjunction with the accumulated documentation and produced a finding that took 5 pages to state but required only its first sentence to understand. The conduct notation filed against Chief Petty Officer Ronnie Caldwell under Section 3.2 C of the JLPAP Evaluation Charter was found to be unsupported by documented evidence and inconsistent with the factual record of the candidate's performance and conduct within the program. 3 days after the Yuma Range evaluation, Sherrick was transferred from program-coordinated duties for JLPAP DET-1. The transfer was handled administratively, with a particular clinical precision that the Navy applies to institutional corrections that it would prefer not to have discussed in context broader than necessary. His replacement as program coordinator was Senior Chief Holloway, who accepted the role with the same expression he brought to recording things on clipboards, absolute neutrality that was itself a very specific form of integrity. Velicourt, in the days after Yuma, underwent his own visible recalibration. He did not apologize. Military culture rarely produces the direct apology as its preferred mechanism of acknowledgement. What he did was simpler and more lasting. He began shooting alongside Turin in the evening preparation sessions. He asked Ronnie once, in passing, between the staging area and the equipment room, whether she was willing to review his firing solution for the 2,000-meter range because he thought his elevation data might be slightly off. She reviewed it. It was slightly off. She told him how to correct it. He nodded. He corrected it. That was the entirety of it. But in the compressed vocabulary of this world, it was enough. If someone in your life has done something like that for you, something small that mattered more than it looked, drop a comment and tell us about it. Sometimes the stories in the margins of a larger story are the ones that stay with us the longest. The remaining 2 weeks of the JLPAP program, under Holloway's coordination, had a different character. Not easier, not softer, but honest. The evaluations meant what they were supposed to mean. The scores reflected what the scores were supposed to reflect. 4 candidates, Rania, Turin, Hernandez, and Park, completed the program's full curriculum. Velacourt completed it with them. Wen and Mercer were offered an extended qualification period for the sections where they needed additional development, an option the program's charter had always included and that had never been offered under Sherrick's coordination. The official program completion ceremony was held at the Naval Special Warfighter Center's main auditorium at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado on a Thursday morning in late February. Rear Admiral Wexfield presided. General Dre had returned to Washington but had sent a written statement that Wexfield read into the program record. A brief, characteristically direct document noting that the Yuma Proving Ground evaluation had produced the single most technically significant precision fire demonstration he had personally witnessed in 31 years of service, and recommending that the program's findings, specifically the documented capabilities demonstrated at 4,000 meters, be formally reported to the Joint Special Operations Command Capability Development Office for integration into future precision fire doctrine development. The statement named one operator specifically. It named her by rank and last name, the standard military format that carries no adjectives and requires none. Wexfield received the graduate's qualification certificates individually. When he reached Rania, he held the folder for a moment before handing it over. He was not a sentimental man, and he did not produce sentiment now. He looked at her with the particular assessment of someone who has revised their understanding of something significant. Chief Petty Officer Caldwell, he said. Admiral. He handed her the folder. I understand this program was more difficult than it needed to be. She held his gaze. The work was what it was, sir. Yes, he said. And in that single word, in the precise and limited way that official acknowledgement moves through institutional language, was everything that the documentation review and the administrative findings and the formal transfers had added up to. She thanked him. She walked back to her position. She sat down with the folder in her hands and the TAC-50 case on the floor beside her chair, and she did not look at the certificate inside the folder. She held it. That evening, after the ceremony, after the administrative closeout procedures and the equipment accountability checks and the conversation with Turin that lasted 2 hours and covered everything from the program to his plans for the next 2 years to what Isaiah Morales had meant when he said that the distance is already there. You just have to decide to cross it. Rania sat alone in the equipment room. The lights were off. The California night came through the single window as a diffuse, sodium-tinted glow. The Pacific was audible if you were still enough to hear it. A low, rhythmic percussion that had been doing the same thing against the same coastline for longer than anyone in that building could personally measure. She opened the rifle case. She removed the bolt assembly and the Schmidt and Bender scope and the suppressor, laying each piece into its foam in the specific order she had maintained since the day she first configured this system. She cleaned the bolt face with a patch and a light application of CLP, wiped the suppressor baffles with solvent, and polished each lens surface of the scope until the glass was clear and perfect. Then she reached into the corner of the case and picked up the brass casing. 750 grains of propellant had once moved through the throat of a rifle not unlike this one and launched a projectile that Isaiah Morales had sent downrange toward a 24-inch steel plate at 2,143 meters, 18 years ago, and had not hit. The round had been a miss. He had told her that. He had told her the story because he understood that the story of a miss, told honestly, was more valuable than any story of a hit. The miss had made him recalculate. The miss had sent him back to the data. The miss had been, in the long architecture of what he eventually became and what he eventually built in her, more important than the hit that followed it. She held the casing between her fingers. Its weight was negligible. 11 grams of spent brass. The same weight it had been the night she first opened this case in a hospital parking lot. Still wearing the black dress from his funeral, the August heat pressing against the car windows while the radio played something she had never been able to remember afterward. She thought about the distance. 4,000 meters. 18 rounds from 6 operators and 13 misses. Then 3 rounds from the person a dead man had spent a decade building, and 3 rounds inside the center ring. Not because of the rifle. Not because of the scope or the suppressor or the ballistic calculator or the 14 months of trigger work. Because of every morning at 0400 in a California scrubland. Because of every wind call made on cold, indifferent range days when the data refused to cooperate and Morales had sat behind her and said nothing useful and everything necessary. Because of a woman who had walked through every gate they had tried to close and calculated her way through every distance they had said was unreasonable, and had done it without noise, without performance, without the theater of proving something to anyone. She had not come to that firing line to prove anything. She had come because the distance was real and she was capable of crossing it, and she had promised a dying man she would. That was all. That was everything. She placed the brass casing back in the corner of the foam. She laid the bolt assembly into its slot. She closed the case. The latches snapped shut with the clean, solid sound of something properly secured. Before the last thing we want to tell you tonight, take a moment and drop a comment if this story meant something to you. If you know someone who carried what Ronia carried, someone who showed up in a room where the door was half closed and pushed it open anyway with nothing but preparation and quiet certainty, tell us about that person. They deserve to be talked about. 6 weeks after the program completion ceremony, Chief Petty Officer Ronia Caldwell was officially assigned as a senior evaluation instructor for the JLPAP curriculum's second iteration, a role that had not previously existed in the program's organizational structure and that Rear Admiral Wexfield had created on the basis of the program documentation findings and General Dre's recommendation. She would be the first person of her rank and background to hold that role. She would be responsible for the extreme long-range precision fire training component of the program's evaluation sequence, which had been formally expanded from 2,500 to 3,500 meters based on the Yuma range data, with a supplementary 4,000-meter demonstration component approved for command-attended evaluations. She moved her gear from the candidate quarters to the instructor's office on the eastern end of the main building. The office was small, 9 feet by 11 feet, with a single window facing the Pacific and a desk that had belonged to at least 4 previous occupants, their history visible in the scratched surface and the 4 different ink colors layered on the blotter. She put nothing on the walls. She put her field manual on the desk and her data cards in the top drawer, and she placed the rifle case in the corner where she could see it from the chair. On her second day in the office, Derek Turin appeared in the doorway. He was in his instructor track now, assigned to the program's basic qualification phase, and he had the look of someone who was genuinely glad to be doing what he was doing. He knocked on the open door even though it was already open. "New candidates arrive in 11 days, he said. "I know." He looked at the rifle case in the corner, then at the desk, then at her. "What are you going to tell them on day 1? She thought about it. She was quiet for long enough that Turin shifted his weight once, the way people do when they realize the question they asked is being taken seriously. Then she said, "I'm going to tell them the distance is already there. They just have to decide to cross it." Turin stood in the doorway for a moment with that. Then he nodded once. "That'll work," he said. He left. She turned to the window. The Pacific was out there beyond the base's fencing and the beach road and the flat, wide winter sand. And the light on it in the afternoon was the kind of light that made the distance look very clear and very manageable, the way light sometimes presents the world with the honesty that the world itself rarely volunteers. She pulled a blank data card from the desk drawer. She picked up her pencil, and she began to calculate. Because that was what she did. That was what Isaiah Morales had built in her. Not the shot, not the distance, not the number on the spotting team's radio, but the willingness to sit down in any room at any hour with a blank card and a sharpened pencil and work the problem from the beginning, every time, with the same focused precision and the same quiet refusal to accept that the distance was anything other than a variable to be solved. There were new candidates coming. 11 days. Some of them would be very good. Some of them would need to become better. All of them would face a range and a target and the long silence of a bullet crossing distances that did not forgive imprecision. She was going to make sure they were ready. She started writing. If this story moved you in some way, if it reminded you of someone who crossed a distance that looked impossible from the outside, or if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when you stood in a room where the door was only half open and you pushed through it anyway, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell us your state. Tell us your story. Tell us who you're watching this for. Because the kind of quiet determination that this story is about does not belong only to firing lines and rifle cases. It lives in offices and classrooms and job sites and all the ordinary rooms where people carry extraordinary weight and show up anyway. Your story matters, hey. Drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of content that stays with you, that settles into you and doesn't leave quickly, then you already know what to do. The rifle case sat in the corner of a small office overlooking the Pacific, its latches closed, its contents perfectly organized, and in its foam a single spent brass casing that weighed 11 grams and nothing at all. A promise, kept across 4,000 meters of open desert, at a distance that 13 of the best-trained precision shooters in the country had looked at and called impossible. And that one quiet woman with a dead man's rifle and a living man's faith had simply called the next problem to solve. The distance was always already there. She had simply decided to cross it.